Hey, everybody, welcome to Making Waves. I'm Drew Leifheit. This is a show where we interview spectacular individuals doing amazing things. I'm a podcast consultant and VO artist, in addition to interviewing wonderful people like Lesley Davis, who is our guest today. Our episode is called Everybody In. How easy is it for a disabled person to navigate Brussels? Lesley will tell us all about it. She's published a two-part series on how she survived getting around the capital of Europe. And it's just another day in the life of her. She's a person whose job has her traveling across the globe for higher education. Lesley's new website is called Everybody In International. On it, she grapples with dismantling the architectural, societal, and policy barriers to equal access. She shares disability travel, mobility equipment, and policy resources to help foment change, and writes about her own personal experiences in her travels. Lesley Davis, welcome to Making Waves, and hello, my friend. Thanks so much for being here.
Hello, Drew Leifheit, old friend. Thank you so much for inviting me to your show.
Wonderful to see you. And love your posters in the background, by the way.
Thank you. I have a large collection of travel posters.
Anyway, so first of all, and I hope everyone will give us a little bit of leeway, since we are old friends. We're going to go a little bit back into some precedents for our subject today, and you know, the first thing is just maybe we could just tell everybody out there how we met. Do you remember?
Well, we met when we were babies, absolute babies.
Right.
There we are. We met at Beloit College in Beloit, Wisconsin in probably 1986. And I believe I met you and my now husband, Matt, at pretty much the same time. We were probably on the steps of the, now I realize, very inaccessible coffee house bar. Yeah, and we've been friends ever since,
Right.
and especially since we both wound up living in Hungary.
Right. Yeah, it's a little bit of an illness in and of itself, isn't it? What about that? Could you talk a little bit about? And of course, we're going to get to the topic of our talk today, but there a little bit of Hungary is intertwined in this whole thing. How did that idea come to you to live in Hungary for a while, just after the political changes and in Central and Eastern Europe?
So I think the short or medium length version of the story is that at our university we had a professor named Michael Simon, who was from Hungary, a Hungarian Jew who left in 1956 after a revolution in Hungary. So like many people, he made his way to the US. He taught photography and was a mentor to many people at Beloit College. And in, I believe, 1988, he started an exchange program between Beloit and the Eötvös Collegium, which is a sort of residential college of Eötvös Loránd, the biggest and oldest university in Budapest. And neither of us studied abroad there, but a lot of our friends did. But more importantly, for the story of winding up in Hungary, is students from there came to Beloit. And in 1990, when it suddenly was very much possible to go there and many other places where it hadn't been possible before, I wound up asking one of those exchange students, do you think I could get a job in your town? A lot of our friends were going to Budapest, and I don't know why I had the forethought at that point to think that would be great fun, but then I'd never probably learn Hungarian because I'd just be hanging out with all these fun people, but maybe not really getting to know the culture. So I asked this one student, and she said, "Oh yes, you should come to my town." And the town was Szentes in southeastern Hungary, town of about 30,000. And I remember, I believe I hand wrote a letter to the headmistress of the gymnasium, asking for a job teaching English and French, and she hand wrote me a letter back saying yes. And my favorite part of the kind of getting to Hungary story is when I went to get my visa at the Hungarian embassy in Washington, D.C. And I had this handwritten letter, and perhaps by that point there was like a typewriter typed kind of employment contract of sorts. And I went and I handed them over. They handed back my passport with a visa in it that said turista, which means tourist. And they had taken a ballpoint pen, scratched out turista, and wrote munkavállalási, or work visa. So they didn't even have work visas at the time, and they just repurposed tourist visas. Those were the heady days when everything was possible. And it soon became clear that everybody needed English teachers because Russian had been compulsory for so long, and while English was being taught, not at the levels that that people wanted to learn English. So that's how the program, originally called Teach Hungary, and then it turned into the Central European Teaching Program, was born. And it was just, me writing letters to people like you saying, "Hey, get over here."
Yeah, I wrote this, and I've been thinking about this the whole time when I thought about interviewing you in the first place. And I mean, you've always been an ass kicker. You have an incredible amount of follow through and deep respect. So I mean, yeah, you're selling yourself short a little bit. I mean, you started a whole program. I mean, like a little Peace Corps, basically, no?
Yeah, I mean, so the Peace Corps was there. The Peace Corps went to Hungary and Poland in 1990. And one of our friends in our town, we didn't know when we went, but there was a Peace Corps volunteer there. Gretchen Nelson, if you're on, hey to you. But one of the missions of the Peace Corps was to serve these schools for 2 years. And then equip them with the tools, or that was part of each teacher's mission, is then equip schools with the tools to, meet their own English teaching needs.
Right.
And so I had Gretchen introduce me to the head of the Peace Corps in Hungary, a great woman named Kathy Rulon. And I met with her and I said, "Look, I don't think all the schools in Hungary are going to have all the English teachers they need after 2 years." And I said, basically, "Can I have your mailing list?"
Wow.
And she's like, "Sure. Here's the list of all the schools we are leaving and all the schools we haven't been able to supply. Go to town." And so then, so I remember getting a little post office box at the post office in Szentes and sending letters with the help of our good friend Shotzi to schools all over Hungary.
Right.
Basically describing what we could offer. I didn't know we could offer it, but the fact that you and several other friends of ours from college had picked up and moved over, I thought, there are going to be more people who can come here to teach English.
Right.
And indeed, at the height of the program, I think we had between Hungary and Romania, where we expanded, I think we had 110 teachers in place at one point.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where there's a will, there's a way. I'd just like to remind everybody, since I'm being Mr. Műsorvezető, Mr. Announcer guy, that you're watching Making Waves. Hello, I'm Drew Leifheit, and we're talking to Lesley Davis, who has become an incredible advocate for mobility issues, and we'll be talking today about her experiences in Brussels, amongst other things. And Lesley, yeah, just to kind of wrap up some of the Hungary stuff, since we shared that. How do you feel? How Hungarian do you feel yourself? I'm just being a little goofy with the what
So
am I
this was for
translation?
Drew and me and many others. This was one of our favorite things about learning Hungarian is the question about how do you feel? How are you, in your skin is a reflexive question. So hogy érzed magad? How do you feel yourself? And
Right.
so many people would literally translate it and they would say, "Oh, Drew, how do you feel yourself?" Which we would of course take to mean all manner of things.
Right.
But as what's interesting, and this is really, I mean, thanks to the help of some friends I've made in Budapest in more recent years, I feel myself more Hungarian than ever because I am now actually a citizen,
Hmm.
um, and now I feel like I've got some catching up to do.
Mm.
Um,
Hmm.
it was not that hard. Well, let me rephrase. The process itself was incredibly bureaucratic and annoying, but Hungary does a sort of rather nationalist kind of bloodline citizenship thing. We could get into all the reasons why perhaps the current government wants to do that, but I am not complaining because I'm a beneficiary. My great great grandparents came from a very small town in eastern Hungary. And so if you can trace where they came from, if you can prove that everybody along the line was born in wedlock,
Mm.
and if you can speak Hungarian, you you can have access to citizenship and voting rights.
Right. Right.
So I have done that,
Excellent. Excellent.
and I'm very happy about that.
Lesley, could you take us a little bit forward? And how did you end up in Bloomington, Indiana? You're at
Oh,
Indiana
yes.
University, right?
Oh, well, oh my God, it's connected to Hungary as well.
Mhm.
So I've been running the Central European Teaching Program. I may have an entrepreneurial spirit in terms of the ideas and in terms of seeing needs, but I'm not really good at the making money part of it.
Mm.
So any help is welcome.
I can relate.
Um, but I knew I was going to continue working in the general field of international education, or educational
Right.
exchange, and a sort of mentor of mine said, "Go get yourself a master's degree. Just at least get a master's. You'll be eligible for more jobs."
Mhm.
And at the time, I mean, now there are all kinds of degrees in international education, intercultural communication, all kinds of things that didn't exist in the early 90s. But
Right.
she said to me, just get a degree in something you're interested in. And I said, well, gee, I guess I'm interested in Hungary. And the place in the United States to do Hungarian studies at the postgraduate level is Indiana University.
Hmm.
Um, it was then, it still is now. Amazing resources here: language, culture, history, literature, um, and shockingly, they didn't require the GRE, which I
Hmm.
would have taken, but was glad not to.
Hmm.
And they gave me a full scholarship. So
Wow.
that's how I wound up in Bloomington, Indiana, for the Hungarian Studies degree within the Department of Central Eurasian Studies,
Mhm.
which is now part of Indiana University's Hamilton Luger School of Global and International Studies.
Uh-huh. And then you stayed on at the university immediately, or?
No, I did. I worked at two other universities.
Mhm.
I worked I never meant to stay in Indiana. I'm not from here, but now I've lived here longer than anywhere I've ever lived before, I guess.
Right.
Um, but I worked at a really interesting college called Wabash College. It's
Mhm.
one of the two all-male colleges left in the United States. Um, and that was a culture shock, but it's an amazing school, small liberal arts college.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I ran the study abroad programs. They also let me teach, and I got to teach Eastern European cinema, which is one of my my great loves.
Wow.
And then I moved a little bit down the road and taught at DePaul University, not to be confused with DePaul University, which is in Chicago. DePaul is in Indiana. Did the same thing. I ran the office for incoming and outgoing exchanges and international, all manner of international things. And then 19 years ago, the Indiana University Law School was looking for somebody to work with their international students, their international partnerships and programs. And that's where I am now. And coming full circle, I was able to develop a really thriving partnership with Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. So
cool.
It does really all come full circle.
Cool. So, it sounds like you've been very successful. You have a husband, a guy that we both know well. You have a beautiful son.
Yep.
Take me back to this time. So you contracted a very rare condition. Tell me what it is and how this all happened.
It's rare. It's rare, but it's not that rare. It's called Guillain-Barré syndrome, and it affects about 1 in 100,000 people. But I can think of 2 Beloit grads right now, Lauren Roseman and Dave Lakin's son had Guillain-Barré syndrome. And what it is an autoimmune condition where your immune system attacks a real or perceived invader, but just like on overdrive. It just overcommits. And in so doing, it attacks the peripheral nerves. So the myelin sheath that insulates the nerves, and then and in some really bad cases like mine, the nerves themselves. So what happens is weakness, and then in some cases paralysis of the usually the feet, hands, legs. So don't think central nervous. Think like way outside. So so yeah, in a pretty rare number of cases, you don't get everything back. Well, most people don't get completely paralyzed. I am one of those people who did. So I spent I don't know, about 6 weeks being completely paralyzed and being on a ventilator, because if your nerves don't work, it means your muscles don't work, and if your muscles don't work, you can't breathe. Which I never put together before, but yeah, so on a ventilator, unable to breathe, unable to move. But what's interesting is I got paralyzed from my toes up, and then unparalyzed from my head down and out. Except I didn't get totally unparalyzed. So my hands, which you might be able to tell are a little wonky looking, my hands, sort of my elbows down and my knees down, are not fully functional. So I use a wheelchair to get around. I can walk with a walker, not for great distances. And because I don't have, I can feel things in my hands and feet, but it's like they're asleep. So it also means that I don't get full input to my brain to tell me where I am in space. That's called proprioception. So I can't walk without touching something because my brain doesn't know where I am. So it is a weird kind of, it's not, it has some things in common with a spinal cord injury. It has some things in common with multiple sclerosis. It's kind of a little taste of both.
At the risk of placing a really stupid question, I know.
Oh, go for it.
I know in some ways this sounds stupid, but what was going through your mind at the time? Like, It's just, I mean, it must be just like mind blowing it's like a revolution or something, no?
Yeah, no, it was, man, I would say it was the biggest exercise in humility I've ever had in my life. Like, for somebody who likes to be as much as possible in control of things, to realize that in an instant you can have absolutely no control. That's a huge and important wake up call, and I wouldn't really wish it on anyone, but it's been just such an incredible learning experience for me. I was in denial for a long time. I spent a year in a hospital and then in a rehab center. Was the youngest patient of the Meadowood nursing home,
Hmm.
um, which was I met some amazing people there. But the the condition is rare enough that in a small city like Bloomington, Indiana, there aren't a lot of people who have seen it. So the neurologist who was with me in the hospital called some neurologists at the bigger hospital in Indianapolis, and um, and basically they said, well, maybe in worst case scenario, 2 years recovery time.
Hmm.
And I just said, no way.
Mm.
That's not going to be me.
Mm.
That won't be me. I won't be the 2 years recovery time.
Right.
Um, and I really railed against that in my mind, and I couldn't accept it.
Hmm.
And then, uh, you know, gradually that stubbornness erodes because when you realize you don't have a choice about it,
Uh-huh.
then you just have to make the best of what you got.
Right.
So, yeah, so obviously it's more than 2 years. And
Mm.
for a long time people said, "Oh, well, will it still come back? Will you be normal again?" And for a while I held out that hope. And then I crossed a bridge at some point
Hmm.
where I was like, "Well, this is who I am now," which
Hmm.
is in fact exactly who I was before,
Uh-huh.
but with some added interest.
Right, right. Now, obviously we've only seen each other periodically over the years since that happened. But so you have regained some mobility though, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, since when I was completely
Right. I
paralyzed.
mean, I mean,
Yeah.
relatively. So, have there been kind of different stages where you got significantly better, or how has that been?
It's all been very slow. And what I say is, when people don't see me for a while and they say, "Oh, I think you've gotten better," or whatever,
Hmm.
um, there's probably nothing happening neurologically in terms of my nerves. What really needs to happen is my nerves need to grow.
Hmm.
But there are a number of factors that need to be in place for that to happen. And there's not a whole lot of research about how to force nerves to grow.
Hmm.
Um, but what it is the longer you live with something, the better you get at it. So I have adapted.
Hmm.
So if I walk better, it's because I practiced more and I got better shoes, or I figured out if I do this, then I'll be more stable.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, I mean, we are tool using apes and we can learn things
Mm,
and
mm,
get
mm,
better.
mm, mm, mm. Um, what about uh how let's say you hadn't seen a friend in a long time, like, how would you describe your life now versus before that happened?
It's so funny. Like, of course, at the beginning, there were a lot of people. We have together like a lot of mutual college friends, and so there were people who were aware of what was happening, right? But then there are people who maybe professionally I hadn't seen in a long time, or had been friends personally and I hadn't seen in a long time, and And I have to think, wait, have they seen me since
Mm,
wheelchair? Have
mm,
they seen me post wheelchair? And I feel a little, I don't know, I feel a little lame about this, but I feel the need to sort of warn people.
mm,
And I need to get a better handle on that. I don't need to warn you. I need to
mm,
let you know that there's I kind of joke about it and I say, I've got a new companion, I've got a new addition,
mm,
I've got this here. Oh, you can't see my wheelchair, but yeah, I got a joystick. Um, but yes, one funny story is there was a friend I hadn't seen in 25 years, and then suddenly I was in France and he had moved to France. And I thought, you know what? We haven't been in touch. He's not on social media. He doesn't know. He's
mm.
not even going to recognize me if I show up in a wheelchair, 25
Right.
years older. And so I sent him a message and I said, well, just something you should be aware of. I might not look like what you expect. And I sent him a link to what Guillain-Barré syndrome was.
Mhm.
And the best thing he did is he sent me back a link and he said, well, you might not recognize me either. And he sent me a link to male pattern baldness. Eric Swanson, if you're listening.
Rock and roll, Eric Swanson.
Yeah.
That's that's some funny shit. Cool.
Yeah.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've had the sense that you have maybe kind of entered a new phase in terms of it's kind of an expression of your life and the kinds of things that you're going through. Is that a fair assessment?
It is. I think I'm in my second act, Drew. And my second act, in some ways, is very personal. Hey, I'm like anybody else. I just happen to have wheels and can't get in everywhere I want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And come to think of it, there are millions of us who, for whatever reason, um, the built environment, such as it is, doesn't really work for us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think exclusion of all types has no place in this world. And if I can make that better, if I can change that and raise awareness about that and show people why it's important, I think that's what I want to do.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah. So you're the name of your website is Everybody in International. And could you just give us in a nutshell the kinds of things that you'd like to shine a light on?
Yes. So I've been doing. I'll start with this sort of policy side. I've been doing a lot of research on the Americans with Disabilities Act. I did some intensive training in that, and I'm now what we call an ADA coordinator, which doesn't mean I know the ADA backwards and forwards, but it does mean that if you have a question, I can find you the answer. And then I've also been doing several deep dives into the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which, in some ways is like an ADA for the world, but in many ways it's a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
It really, it really addresses access and removal of barriers of all kinds.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not just talking physical barriers, as being a human right.
Mm-hmm.
And it is up to the nations that have signed on to the UN Convention to enact the laws that would enable people with disabilities to have equal access to everything.
Mm-hmm.
To employment, to education, to facilities, to
Right.
voting, to government, to healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And, the thing about, international conventions and treaties is that everybody wants to be seen as, being on the right side of history or being in the club and
Mm-hmm.
signing on. But they don't signing on to these treaties doesn't mean anything until
Mm-hmm.
you change the national, local laws to comply with what you say you're going to do. And 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 through my various efforts, I want to make places like Hungary, like Brussels, put their money where their mouth is.
Right.
When it comes to people with disabilities, which are 1 in 10 people in the world.
Wow.
Over 1 billion people have some form of disability. And if you live long enough, you too will have some form of disability.
Right. Okay, so you just mentioned Brussels. That seems like a good place to enter into the fray. A nice city full of policy people. You may have policy, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily an accessible place. Is that
That is so true. That is so true. Yeah, I mean, it was so funny. I went to Brussels. I don't think I'd been there before. I'd been to Belgium, but I had never been to Belgium in a wheelchair. Hadn't been to Brussels. And part of what I do is I study a lot about where I'm going and what the accessibility features are. And I knew I was in for some challenges. But I didn't know how challenging it would be. And I think my biggest complaint about Brussels is the sidewalks. Sidewalks without curb cuts, so without the little ramps that allow you to transition. Or if there is a curb cut, you can get off one sidewalk, but then you're in the middle of the road looking for somewhere where you can get up.
Get back up.
Also public transportation. They're trying. Brussels has a great network of trams, but very, very few of them are accessible. And I'm not entirely sure what their timeline is. They're supposed to be making them all accessible, but they aren't. But what's really, really telling is on that trip, I was on a trip for work. The Brussels part was me really digging into some of the disability organizations that are present in Brussels. And well, those buildings were accessible and full of young idealists who are changing the world. But think of the European Union institutions as very separate from and the organizations that work, in advocacy and lobbying capacities for those EU institutions. In a way, they could be anywhere. In a way, Brussels is absolutely secondary. Their work, making policy and advocating for things within the European Union has really nothing to do with the daily life of Brussels, Belgium. There isn't an arm, as far as I know, of the European Commission that says, oh yeah, by the way, like, how accessible is the city where we happen to be located?
Right.
And in a way, that's not their job. So what I realized is no different for Brussels than it is for anywhere else in the world, is the accessibility of your city is very much dependent on the grassroots efforts of the people in that city. There is no EU legislation that governs the current state of the built environment. So even though there are lots of things the European Union is doing, and especially an organization called the European Disability Forum is doing to improve accessibility within EU member states, this is happening now, whereas in the US, the Americans with Disabilities Act happened in 1990.
Mhm.
And it was a long, long time getting there. And even still, we know that not everywhere in the United States is accessible. So the fact that there may be a law at this level doesn't mean that at your local level, everything is magically
Mhm.
as you want it. And so, despite all the best efforts at the European Union level, the real change happens on site with people and not even at the country level. This happens very much at the municipal level, or if you look at Germany, for example, at the regional level. Some regions of Germany are more committed to accessibility than others.
Mm.
And it's a real patchwork. And Brussels, it's probably not the worst in Europe.
Mhm.
And there are other parts of Belgium that are far better than Brussels.
Mhm. Hmm.
But you can see where the priorities are.
Mhm.
And, in a way, it's sort of like, yeah, all these people in Brussels are working for European Union institutions and et cetera, et cetera. And I met one wonderful man who is Italian, works for the European Network for Accessible Tourism. And in his little corner of Brussels, he's working with a bunch of other concerned citizens to
Mhm.
make things like bus stops and parks and restaurants
Mhm.
at least accessible from a mobility standpoint.
Right. Right.
And that's how it works.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So, if I understood correctly, are you saying that in general, the state of accessibility in the United States is much, much better?
Then in the European Union,
Yeah.
yes, doesn't mean it's perfect. But yes, but we've been at it for longer.
Right.
And we are a federal system that works in a much more cohesive way because
Mhm.
we've been a federal system since our inception,
Right.
as opposed to the European Union, which is a more recent federal system where federal law, well, you know,
Right. Yeah, it's kind of that, s- there's a certain amount of autonomy as to how some things are applied or not applied, or
yes. But the most interesting and I think ingenious thing about um, in terms of disability with European Union level efforts is that if you're a country like Hungary, let's say, or Romania or Portugal, or a country that is less wealthy, and therefore mm, you have access to a lot of funding from the European Union,
right.
specifically European structural and development funds. If you apply for and get money in that scheme,
Hmm.
you need to make your project. So if it's a structural project, it's a building, it's a renovation, it's a new subway line, it's new buses. The EU has said, okay, all those things have to be accessible.
Hmm.
And public procurement, we're going to get new stuff and the EU is going to help pay for it. Well, then that stuff has to take into account people with disabilities.
Hmm.
And so that's the genius of it.
Right.
Um,
Right.
does everybody always comply? No,
Hmm. Interesting.
no. And my friends at Mayos in Hungary, which is the sort of umbrella organization for a bunch of disability organizations, have pointed out a number of projects in Hungary, the Czech Republic, or Slovakia, I think Slovenia as well, where large amounts of European structural funds were used, and yet um, they didn't make them as accessible as they should have, or accessible at all.
Mhm.
And this is a similar problem with the Americans with Disabilities Act. There aren't any, police that go around enforcing
Mm.
accessibility. You don't have the ramp the
Right.
ramp cops or whatever.
Right.
So it really is up to, citizens, organizations, NGOs to
Mm.
point out, your work isn't finished here.
Mm. Well, and that brings me kind of back to your blog too. So I think that your storytelling is amazing in terms of some of the granular nature of your experience. For example, could you talk a little bit about the Airbnb thing, right? So who would think that in the capital of Europe, even though I'm sure there must be thousands and thousands of Airbnb flats, what did you encounter?
So, any person with a disability, especially mobility disability, knows that you reserve an Airbnb at your own peril,
Mm.
right? And there are various tricks to making sure that you're getting what you need, because if you don't have a disability or the type of disability that I have, because everybody's disability is different. Or if you don't know or live with someone with a disability, or if you're an Airbnb host who's asked, do you have an elevator? You say, well, yeah. Do you have a step to get in? You say, I don't really think that's a step. It's like, it's not a step. Like there is, there isn't a kind of universal template such that people know how to assess their own accessibility. I mean, there are all kinds of templates out there. I'm happy to share them, but anyway, the point is, I noticed about Brussels is that very, very few people checked off any accessibility features, and so I knew I was in for, a challenge. But I found this building, saw it had an elevator. Then the key is you look at it on Google Street View, and you figure out from the street view, is there a step? And I could see that there was a small step, but I didn't know how big or small. So I contacted the Airbnb host, and he went and he measured it for me. And it was questionable. It's going to be questionable whether I was going to be able to do it.
Right.
But all the pictures of the apartment, I realized for me, this would work. But that is also because I am able to stand. I am able to hold on to things. And I said, hey, Simon, could you put a chair in that, beautiful shower that has a step about this big to get in? And so that worked for me. If I weren't able to get out of the wheelchair, it wouldn't have worked for me.
Right.
But I was counting on this elevator, see? And unfortunately, I think in the Airbnb interface, could be that you say you have an elevator and it kind of defaults to saying that the elevator is this big and this wide. Well, Simon didn't measure his elevator. He just checked the box. So I get there. I managed with the help of a passing stranger to get up the threshold. And meanwhile, I'm thinking, okay, I can hack that. We can fix that. I know it's not that big. But I get to the elevator, and there is no way my chair is fitting in the elevator. And it was one of those moments where there I am with all my luggage, and I'm like, this isn't work. This can't happen.
Right.
So I had a backup plan. I booked it down the street with the help of a delightful neighbor in the building who said, let me carry your stuff. Oh, this is terrible. Oh, the elevator doesn't fit. And I contact the owner and I say, well, here's the deal. My chair can't fit in the elevator.
Right.
And your Airbnb listing said the elevator was this big. And he said, geez, where did it say it was this big? I didn't measure it. I don't know.
Right.
So Anyway, but this was the beginning of a beautiful friendship and a great educational opportunity. And my host, who is ever resourceful, said, okay, here's what we're going to do. Thing is, my elevator, my wheelchair could fit in the elevator if it was folded. It's just that I can't fold it myself and remain upright, you know? So every night, with my walker, I would go up to the apartment. He would fold the wheelchair and then bring it up behind me. And then I had it to roll around the apartment with. And then in the morning, we reversed the process. Now, I don't think that Simon wants to advertise that as a service he offers, but not only did he do that for me, he also built me a makeshift ramp just out of stuff he found at the hardware store to get up that little threshold.
Right.
And so one thing I will tell you about absolutely everybody I met in Brussels is they are incredibly kind, resourceful, and concerned about the accessibility of their city, or at least concerned about it when they encounter someone who's having trouble with it.
Right.
And since this time, there is a new feature that I don't know why this has not been more highly touted, and I'll see what I can do about that. But Airbnb has a whole new section called Airbnb Adapted. And I think they're marketing it primarily right now to people who have and offer Airbnbs. And so I think probably what they did is they gathered together all those places that really take the accessibility information seriously. And so that's a great step. I mean, I have my issues with Airbnb, but this is a great step, and I want to help amplify that.
Well, you know, I'll sound like a capitalist, but it does sound like a market niche, you know?
Well, there is the business case for accessibility that people make successfully, including my friends at Access for You in Budapest. It's a lot easier for people to make the business case for accessibility when they're talking about new construction. And indeed, you know, certainly within the United States and within Europe, most countries have laws that say new construction of buildings, not necessarily apartment buildings, but definitely, you know, like shopping malls, office buildings, they do need to meet certain standards of accessibility. But, you know, the argument goes further than that, in that, what, you're renovating this restaurant? Well, then get rid of that step, because suddenly you've got a captive audience of people with nowhere else to go except the restaurant that's accessible. You know, even though the vast majority of people with disabilities in the world live in poverty, because disability and poverty go hand in hand, primarily because the world was not built for everyone. That being said, the disability travel and tourism and spending market is not insignificant, and to ignore that is foolish.
Right. Hey, this is just a reminder out to everyone out there. Thanks for being with us. You're watching Making Waves, and my guest is my dear old friend Lesley Davis, and she's emerging to become kind of an advocate for international mobility issues. Lesley, I would like to open things up for questions, but I think maybe they'll only come a little bit later. So if anybody out there has a question, please feel free to write it in the chat and we can post it on screen. I think that only in the future will I be adept enough to invite somebody into the chat, although maybe that's possible. But we'd love your questions and your shout outs. Let me just say, first of all, so far we got shout outs from Amy Drever, Robert Hallworth, Luigino Bottega, Susan Balint, my friend, Diana Oluzzino, who I've recently become acquainted with, Lucy Gray, our old friend, and Patrick Kagan, my high school mate. Anyway, as I said, thanks again for listening. We hope that you're enjoying the conversation and would welcome your questions in the chat. And maybe even I could get you in if I can try doing it. And Lesley, what about other things, going around Brussels, restaurants, access to other buildings, things like this? How was that?
Yeah, restaurants was bad. Except luckily when I was there, spending time with your lovely wife, who was also there, it was September, the weather was great, and there are a lot of places with outdoor seating. But everywhere where we chose to sit outdoors, well, let me just say it wasn't exactly a choice.
Mm-hmm.
There was not an option to sit indoors.
Right.
But TripAdvisor and Yelp to some extent are good at providing information, like very specific, is there a ramp or not? So I absolutely would use that. I was trying to meet some other friends in Brussels for dinner, and they chose a few places, and then I looked them up online, and again on Google Earth, and I said, or Google Street View, and I said, I don't think it's accessible. I think there's a step. Sure enough, we worked our way through 4 or 5 places before finding one that was actually in the lobby of a hotel. It was kind of small, independent, interesting hotel. And so that was fine. There's threshold-free entrance, but getting there in the rain, believe it or not, Brussels has a lot of steep hills, insufficient curb cuts. It was a gauntlet. It was an absolute gauntlet, and I had to ask help from no more than 3 strangers to sort of push me up and around and over things just to get there from the bus. Right. The bus system, by the way, in Brussels, almost all of them have ramps. Almost, and all the bus drivers are good about it, and friendly and not annoyed, or at least not seemingly. So yes, so we had a lovely meal, and then there's not a single accessible toilet there. Right. Luckily I didn't drink that much, but not in the lobby, not on the floor with the conference rooms. So and that's just not okay. Right. It's not that it's just not okay for me. It's just not okay in 2022. That's true. In the capital of Europe.
Yeah, one would think. Hey, we're very lucky to have a comment from someone I think you know. Hold on, I'm just going to put it on the screen. Bada bing.
Well, hey. Well, Robert Hallworth, dear old friend with whom I traveled in the pre-disability days in Ireland. What innovative developments have I found to make inaccessible areas more accessible in the absence of municipal modifications? Well, I have found, and I've made it my goal for many months to find this elusive thing. Ramps are everything for people with wheelchairs. Mm-hmm. And so if you cannot count on where you're going being ramped, then I encourage those who have the kind of dexterity and strength to do so to bring the ramp with them. So there's an ultralight ramp. That was the key. All the ramps you can find online tend to be unwieldy and really heavy, and not something one can easily carry around with them. But there is a ramp made by Dunlop, the people who make the tires and the tennis balls. And it is an ultralight ramp made of carbon fiber reinforced fiberglass. I can pick it up with one finger, which is handy because I don't have a lot of strength in my hands. And it's short. The one they make a lot of different lengths, but the one I have is 27 inches. I can put it down the back of my wheelchair, which is what I did in Budapest last summer.
Mm-hmm.
And it allowed me to go, basically, it allowed me to get up and down sidewalks where there are major intersections in Budapest, which will surprise no one, that there is no way to get off the sidewalk except take stairs to go on an underpass or through an underpass.
Right.
But it allowed me to do that. It allowed me to get into a number of restaurants, a number of office buildings. And it was a game changer. And this is not surprisingly, these are manufactured in Japan, and they are used in Japan for access to trains. And so, and there's a US-based office distributor. And if you go on my website and you're interested in one of these, and you contact the person that I've listed there, you too can get a discount on that ramp, which is not cheap. But that thing is not going to break.
Tell them Lesley sent you.
Exactly.
Hey, we just had another comment here from Susan.
Hi, Susan.
And that's a wonderful comment. And thanks also, Robert, for your wonderful question. Robert kind of touched upon, of course, the ramp, but you do have some interesting writing about different modes of transport, your equipment. That seems like a real journey in and of itself, just trying out different kinds of things. Could you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So like I was saying, everybody's disability is different. One thing doesn't work for everyone, but so many things, work for so many different diagnoses, as we say. There's a wheelchair that I use when I travel, which is not the same wheelchair that I use when I'm at home. And the one I use when I travel, which you've seen, Drew, it folds up essentially like a lawn chair. The challenge, and this works okay for me getting on planes because I can roll it up to the entrance of the plane in most countries. Some countries don't let you. But then I have the ability, if I can grab onto things, to then step into the plane, hold on to the backs of the seats or the overhead luggage bins, and go sit down in my seat.
Right.
And then the challenge is instructing people in different languages that I may or may not know how to fold the chair. Because there are a couple steps. To it. But I've traveled a lot with this chair, and it's gotten dinged a little bit. It's gotten scratched. It has not broken.
Right.
And that is the fear of everybody who travels with mobility equipment.
Oh, yeah.
Especially if they don't have other options. If they're not going to be able to make do with a walker, or if they're not going to be able to make do with one of those standard hospital style manual chairs. Your chair gets broken, your legs have been broken.
Right.
I have a much younger, more daring friend who travels to the most inaccessible places he can go with his giant 350-pound Permobil wheelchair.
Wow.
And the adventures he has had, I mean, but I get it. It's, in a way, it's a weird kind of like crypt thrill seeking. Like, can I do it? Can I get my chair to Iguazu Falls and back?
Right.
Without total destruction. But I did want to pivot to Susan's comment. People don't get into doing disability work just because it seems cool or lucrative. Like people who are interested in this without fail know somebody
Mm-hmm.
or they themselves have become disabled.
Right.
So I am like anybody else who would not have noticed that there was one step to get into a place
Mm-hmm.
until it meant that I couldn't get into the place.
Right.
And
Right.
now anybody who's with me, by extension, notices, and that's fine. I was at a city council meeting here in Bloomington the other day, and I said, look, I don't expect you all to know what is and is not accessible.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got great resources in people who do know from their daily lives what is and is not accessible.
Right.
It's not a crime not to know,
Mm.
but it kind of is a crime to know and then not do anything about it.
Sure. 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 That makes total sense. This is just another reminder. Yeah, we are. I think we're headed to the promised land here on Making Waves. We've got a few more minutes. If anybody out there would like to place a question. Oh, and a question has popped up from Amy Drever. Hold on. Here we go.
What do you think it will take to get more people to see accessibility as a human right? Amy Drever, I love you for that question. I think like everything else, it's going to be a fight. And if you look at disability history and if you look at the efforts of people like Judy Heumann, if anybody hasn't seen the movie Crip Camp, watch it, enjoy it, revel in it. But I think it's going to be, and I think it's happening, it's going to be a top down and a bottom up somewhere meeting
Mm-hmm.
in an accessible middle. Because when I mentioned the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that is, it's an aspirational goal.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't have aspirational goals, we don't have a guidepost.
Mm.
But also the UN Sustainable Development Goals also have a lot to say
Mm-hmm.
about, treating everyone humanely, giving everyone access. So there are policy level things that are absolutely looking at disability and access as an equity, as a human right,
Mm-hmm.
which is in stark contrast even to the way the ADA was written. And the other thing that I think is going to help is when people like me, wheelchair users, are doing the same kinds of jobs that non-disabled people are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then other people see us.
Right.
Just so case in point, I went back to Hungary for the first time in 2017 with a wheelchair. So all my previous time in Hungary, I had not been a person with a wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to our university partner, and there was a European exchange program coordinators called Erasmus, that any of you Europeans know about, but there was a big Erasmus meeting, and it was in the beautiful old building of the Faculty of Law at Edouard University. And somebody had, and of course, all my colleagues there knew I used a wheelchair, and somebody built me a ramp to get into the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And this ramp was incredibly steep
Oh,
and
yeah.
incredibly scary.
Uh-huh.
And on the one hand, I was grateful that somebody cared enough
Mm-hmm.
that I be in the room, that they built me a ramp.
Right.
On the other hand, why the hell did they have to build a ramp?
Yeah.
So on the they do make these things off the shelf.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But I was just a visitor for a week.
Mm.
What about all the students?
Mm-hmm.
Or, oh my God, professors, administrators
Mm-hmm.
who can't go into that room?
Right.
And it took some time, and I am not the only. Um, I was not the only one to apply pressure, but I did.
Mm,
And I wrote to the rector of the university and I said, I love this country. I love this university. I care deeply about its reputation.
mm,
And you are a world class university, and therefore you should be open to everyone.
mhm.
And I was so happy to learn that last summer it has finally, it is finally being changed,
Uh-huh.
thanks to the efforts of a bunch of colleagues, because enough people raise the issue, and nobody, I can't say nobody, but it is getting harder and harder to deny that accessibility, that equal opportunity, that the absence of barriers should
Mm,
be a human right.
mhm, mhm,
So there's, you need pressure from both sides,
mm.
and we're probably not going to get as far as we need to go in my lifetime, but now's the time to keep pushing.
Well, hey, it sounds like you really contributed to that. Congratulations.
Thanks.
It had me thinking too, though, there's also this kind of chicken and egg kind of situation now. Think of all the people, maybe they work in international education, maybe they're people who would want to travel, who are disabled and would just avoid it because they just think, oh, it's just too much of a pain in the ass. No? It's so sad to think about.
So I think about all the people who live in inaccessible cities who are living in the kind of old mode of
Mhm,
thinking about disability. And
mm,
that would be the charity model of disability, or even the medical model of disability, where
right,
it's like, oh, poor you, you are an invalid, you are
mhm,
invalid.
right,
um, your place is to be taken care of by other people in an
mhm,
apartment where you can't do anything for yourself. You can't
mm,
get out by yourself. You
right,
can't meaningfully contribute to the work of the family. But why? Because the structures weren't built for you.
mhm,
In many cases, and
right,
that's just not a good enough excuse
yeah,
for people not to be able to take part in society. I can't, people who say I can't have a job, or I can't go there, or I can't do this. It's not about them. It's not about them as a human not being able to get there.
mhm,
It's about there being obstacles in the way.
right,
And I was reading an article once where a doctor who is a white woman talking about who becomes doctors, and how, well, women, minorities, certainly people with disabilities, are underrepresented in that profession. And she said, power is the absence of obstacles. And so many people who have achieved things in their lives have been able to do so because there were no obstacles in their
mhm,
way.
mhm,
And just think of how much power people could have if
mm,
there was an absence of obstacles.
right, right. Leslie, what are your thoughts, to anyone, be they disabled or people who don't struggle with these issues? What are your takeaways from, your life and sort of having to deal with this?
Um, so um, I think the big takeaway is that, don't pity people who have disabilities, um, because there are some people who, when who just, it breaks their heart that I'm disabled, that I that I have to use a wheelchair. Um, I, I think that's a waste of time.
Mm,
And that's a waste of emotional energy,
mhm,
because I would hope, and anybody watching this right now, if you aren't currently disabled, or if you weren't born disabled, you may well find yourself disabled. You could step off the sidewalk, get hit by a bus, and then you too will be disabled. And I certainly would hope that you would not give up on every hope, dream, or activity that you ever held dear. So to, if you just to think, oh, I can't imagine my life. What would it be if I had to use a wheelchair? Well, I don't know. It's pretty much like my life was before.
Right.
But I've had to work to make it that way.
Sure.
And yeah, lots of things are harder. And yeah, I have the advantage of this having happened to me later in life. But other people who are much better at managing with their limited mobility are much better at it because they've been doing it longer than I have. But to think that somehow you are different, or that the person with a disability is really fundamentally other or different from you, it's just a false premise. Because one person's humanity is just intrinsically bound up with everyone else's humanity. Or that's the way I like to look at it.
Right. Okay, and once again, everyone, thanks for being here today. Lovely to talk to Lesley Davis. Lesley, take us to the promised land. What do you got have in store? What would you like to do going forward?
So I think like I was responding to Amy's question, I would I have a couple big passions in life, and one of them is traveling. But traveling for a purpose. I love traveling because I love the way different people do things, the way different people have built things, the way people all over the world think about the same questions. And so that's my favorite part of my career and my favorite part of my life. And marrying that together with making the world a place that anybody can access if they have, giving them the opportunity to access it. And I think that that I need to start, like I have in my own community. You start at the local level. And my next big my next mini project is, if anybody's seen, it made the rounds on social media recently, though it's from a few years back. There's the Lego grandma, the Lego Oma, lovely woman named Rita Ibel, who lives near Stuttgart in Germany, who has lives in a typical European city where every shop has one step to get in it. She is a wheelchair user. So she and her husband started building ramps out of Legos. And so she has shared the Lego ramp plans with me. Wow. And I'll soon be putting this up on my blog. But now, virtually every shop in this little town in Germany has its own bespoke Lego ramp. So like the candy shop has the Haribo bears on its ramp, and the pub has the soccer ball and the beer stein on its ramp. But so there's that project. There's also a wonderful guy in Toronto doing a ramp project where groups of people build ramps. Toronto is another old city. They build wooden ramps, very cheap, very easy to manufacture, bright, paint them bright colors and put them in front of shops. And you can request a ramp. This is not a big money-making venture, but the whole point is, when you put the beautifully colored, or the ramp made of Lego outside of the shop, anybody who walks by that needs to ask themselves, why is that there? Right. Oh, wait a minute, this place might be difficult for somebody to get into. And in this way, you spread the knowledge. that there's a need. Right. And then when that person goes on to be property developer or build their new home, they think, well, wait a minute. Someday somebody with a wheelchair might need to get in here, or maybe there's somebody with a baby stroller and they might need to get in here, or somebody might need to age in place, or suddenly everybody lives to 100 years old and something's going to break down. So I want it to just become the fabric of the built environment. And the way that's going to happen is for people to be reminded of it and to think about it. And then I want at the upper levels, be it the European Union or otherwise, to get to the point where there are standards in place so that someone can have an expectation that if they move from one city to another, take the train from one place to another, that they can count on a minimum level of accessibility, and they know what that means, and they know how they have to prepare, and they know that it's not going to prevent them from getting to that job interview or being able to go to that hotel or use that toilet.
Wow. Yeah, those are definitely so many things to think about now.
Thank you, Lara, for the Lego Oma. We're doing a ramp. We're going to be doing a ramp in Bloomington. I'll expect your fingers. They work better than mine.
Rock and roll. Rock and roll. Lesley, is there anything else that you would like to say?
So I realize, people in the disability community hear this a lot, and it seems a little overused and trite at this point. But I realize that not everybody knows this saying, which is nothing about us without us. And so it doesn't have to be a person with a disability. Insert your marginalized group and then ask yourself that. Nothing about us without us. And if you don't know whether it's about us, the answer is probably yes, it is. Just open your minds to the possibilities, and be excellent to each other.
Right. A little bit of consideration, compassion, empathy. We could spread a bit of that around these days, it seems.
Yep.
Well, hey, yes, exactly. You're doing it, and
you're doing it.
I love your mobility diplomacy. It's definitely.
Hey, I like that.
Yeah. It's we just got another comment from another friend of ours, Susan. Hi, Susan.
Hey, Susan.
Thanks for your feedback. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do here. I hope to be talking to other fantastic people like Lesley. Lesley, thank you so much for the wonderful conversation.
Drew, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank everybody for joining us. This was super fun.
Dear watchers, listeners, we hope to come back to you soon. Please feel free to connect amongst yourselves. Please friend me, friend Lesley. If you want any other details to contact Lesley, feel free to contact me if that's easier or whatever. But I think you have her contact details through LinkedIn for one. Thank you, Robert, also for your question and for tuning in. So I guess that about wraps us up. I'm just going to say a little spiel here at the end. Lesley's just one of the spectacular individuals doing amazing things in a difficult world that I plan on continuing to interview on Making Waves. Stay tuned. I'm Drew Leifheit. Peace, and love you, Lesley, and talk to you soon.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, Drew.
Thank you. Bye.